Astronomy in Reverse by Pansley. Chapter 11. Pursued. The look of surprise on Steve's face momentarily stuns Bucky. It's almost as though Steve didn't expect him to come through the door, like they just happened to run into each other on the street by happenstance. There's a flicker of confusion in his expression before he draws his gaze to Peter, the silence between the three of them thick and stifling in the air. Peter huddles a little further against the counter, frightened and unnerved by the intensity of Steve's stare, but he doesn't see what Bucky sees, doesn't see the worry and disbelief, the almost full-bodied denial Steve is portraying. He keeps his eyes on Peter a moment longer, trying to fit the pieces together in his head before he turns back to Bucky, and his expression completely changes. It amazes him how well he still knows Steve Rogers. Really, he should probably be proud of that, of what it says about his intelligence or his cognitive ability or whatever it is that has let his brain persevere after the kind of abuse it's been through. It's remarkable that after everything, after being tortured a million times, after being separated for almost a century, Bucky can still tell by the look on Steve's face that he's not here to help. It's the way his jaw is clenched, really. There's grief in his eyes outlined by the material of his mask, which leaves the lower half of his face completely open. That downturned mouth, the tightness of his frown, teeth gritted to keep himself from saying what he really wants to, the wrong thing. Bucky can guess what it is he wants to say, what Steve would have said if it was just the two of them, but it isn't. This isn't Steve and Bucky reuniting. This is Captain America finally tracking Bucky down. Steve squares his shoulders, standing taller, all but proving Bucky's point. Someone obviously tipped him off. Who knows, could have been the lady downstairs, or their landlord, or even Mr. Dalmar, for all the difference it would make. But whoever led Steve here, it's clear that he's not the only one. The distant sirens and babble of a voice from Steve's earcom are proof enough of that. They don't have time to wait, and they definitely don't have time for a fight either. This whole building is swarming with law enforcement. Bucky keeps his gaze locked with Steve's as he forces his shoulders to relax slightly, the metal plate in his left making that especially difficult with its considerable weight. He's never known Steve, Captain America or otherwise, to wait for the other person to speak first, not even before the war. But at this very moment, Steve seems more than content to wait and see what Bucky has to say. So Bucky holds his gaze and says, "I wasn't in Vienna." He tries, but he can't quite keep the guilt out of his voice. "I don't do that anymore." To his surprise, Steve actually seems to believe him, the tenseness of his shoulders relaxing slightly. His eyes betray the straight face he's desperately trying to keep up. He opens his mouth, but what Bucky expects him to say couldn't be farther from what he does. "Why is there a kid here?" Peter tenses against the kitchen counter, clutching Bucky's backpack tighter in his arms. Bucky's own face must change too, because Steve hardens his stance and glances him over like he's sizing him up. "Buck," he says again, voice even, despite the imploring look in his eyes, "why are you living with a kid?" He doesn't expect Steve to understand, but he tells him the truth anyway. "Because he's mine." He nods his head in Peter's direction, doesn't look away from Steve as he raises his face. "He's my kid." If this wasn't a crisis, the look on Steve's face might have actually been funny. His lips part like he's trying to speak but has no idea what to say, eyes narrowing as he racks his brain, trying to make sense of what the hell Bucky just said to him. It's as good a distraction as any. "Peter," Bucky says, "come on, time to go." Peter immediately moves to go around Steve, but he flinches with stop when Steve lifts his arm in front of him, blocking him. "Wait, Buck, he says in frustration, clearly still rattled by the bomb Bucky dropped on him. "I can't let you leave." "They think I bombed the UN," Bucky says slowly, letting the weight of the situation sink into his words. "Safe bet they're planning to shoot first and ask questions later. We've got to move." A tortured look crosses Steve's face. "I can't let you," he says again, lowering his arm as he steps toward Bucky. "I need you to come with me. Don't make this end in a fight, Buck." "No! No!" Both of them startle when Peter dashes between them, his back to Bucky, arms thrown out protectively as he stares up at Steve. Bucky can't see the look on his face, but the tense, frightful, unmistakably determined tone of his voice rings clear as day. "You're not taking him!" Steve stares down at him in surprise, brows drawn together in confusion. Bucky can practically see the wheel turning in his head, and he sighs and reaches out for Peter's hood, pulls him back away from Steve, trying to herd him off to the side. But Peter plants his feet on the floor with his damn superpowers like he's immovable, so Bucky lays a hand on his shoulder and says, "Kid, stop it. You're not fighting anybody. Get behind me." "You said I couldn't end in a fight!" Peter protests, still glaring up at Steve, so goddamn stubborn when he wants to be. "And I'm not gonna let him hurt you!" A crack forms in Steve's expression, a hint of something akin to pain breaking through the incredulity and confusion on his face. The two of them could probably take Steve down, or at least immobilize him, but they can't afford to waste that kind of time, and the less Steve and whatever organization he's working for knows about Peter, the better. "We don't have that kind of time," he tells him, hating how tight the muscle of Peter's shoulder is beneath his hand, how clearly stressed and frightened his son is. He tries to make his voice soothing. "Peter, kiddo, we have to go. Come on, we have a plan, remember?" Peter starts to relax, his shoulder loosening slightly under his palm, but then Steve steps forward again with a stern, "You're both going to have to come with me." Peter lifts his hand as fast as lightning and shoots 2 blasts of webbing from his wrist that glue Steve's feet to the floor. Steve and Bucky share a surprised look before Bucky is clapping Peter on the back and bending down to grab his discarded backpack. "Let's go," he says to the boy as he pulls his arms through the straps, leading him to the door. "Buck!" Steve calls after him, trying to pull his legs free of the webbing. Bucky turns back as he holds the door open for Peter, lets a moment pass between him and Steve in place of a goodbye, knowing the other man can clearly see the resolution on his face. He doesn't say anything as he follows Peter out of the apartment, letting the door fall closed behind him. The sirens are louder the moment they step outside, blaring as they converge on them from all directions. The first of them are no doubt just around the corner, so Bucky takes Peter's shoulder in his hand again and kneels down to gaze up at his son severely. "Peter, we're going to have to split up, okay?" Panic washes over Peter's face. "What?" he says, watery and afraid. "But why can't we just go?" "Steve didn't know you were here," Bucky says urgently, desperate to make him understand. "He didn't know about you. They're only after me, Peter, and I can outrun them. Go ahead without me, and we'll meet at the rendezvous just like we planned." Peter shakes his head desperately, his eyes welling up. Bucky takes his face in hands and begs, "I can't let them find you. You know that. I promise, Peter, I'm going to meet up with you. I just need you to go on ahead of me, please." The sirens wail not even a street away, and those webs won't hold Steve for long. "Go," Bucky says as he stands back up, ushering Peter to the edge of the balcony, his own panic bleeding into his voice. "Go, now!" Peter whimpers, but ducks his head, pulling his hood up as he webs off the side of the balcony onto the adjacent roof before running and making a break for the direction of the rendezvous. Bucky sighs his relief, the stress lessened now that his kid is momentarily out of harm's way. He makes for the roof in the opposite direction, planning to lose his ever tailing him before looping back to their meeting place. It's a long jump from the end of his balcony to the windowsill on the building across from him, but Bucky swiftly and agilely maneuvers over the outside of the building until he's booking it across the flat rooftop. The sirens fade out below him the farther away he gets, his backpack a heavy weight on his back. As the edge of the building gets closer, Bucky takes a deep breath and builds momentum for the leap, feet steady as he pushes off the ledge, adrenaline surging as he's airborne before meeting the lip of the next building, landing ungracefully with a sideways roll before he's back on his feet, running again. And then he sees the shadow overhead. He barely has a chance to throw himself out of the way before the body lands on him, a man in a suit pitch black and feline with narrowed white eyes. Bucky staggers back to his feet, eyes wide and panting, as the stranger brandishes metal claws from the tips of his fingers and then lunges at him, aimed for his throat. Bucky counters as best he can, blocking punches and kicks as they come, though his own blows don't seem to be landing with as much force as they should. Maybe it's the suit, or as the outfit would suggest, this isn't a typical fighter he's dealing with. Great! His opponent leaps forward, and Bucky loses his footing, trying to dodge out of the way, landing on his backpack painfully as he's pinned by the other man. He narrowly avoids a handful of metal claws to his face and grapples for the upper hand, his vision obscured by a raised hand, claws poised for the kill, swiping down for his neck. He crosses his arms in front of his face to absorb the damage, bracing himself. Suddenly, the stranger is hit by something, knocked sideways, his body leaving Bucky's entirely. Bucky pushes himself up, panting, eyes searching the man's body for any sign of white webbing. Peter? But there is none, and when Bucky turns his head, he sees Steve, hands raised to catch his shield, ricocheting back to him, running to the edge of the building, where he leaps to land where they are. Bucky jumps to his feet and beelines for the nearest ledge. It doesn't matter now what direction he goes in. He can find his way to Peter after he loses them, no matter where he ends up. The black-suited stranger is quick to pursue him, hot on his heels, Steve not far behind him. Bucky grits his teeth in frustration and vaults over the side of the building, jumping from narrow ledge to narrow ledge as he makes his way down, until he lands hard on the street below. There's traffic and pedestrians all around them, and sirens still blaring not far away, the whir of helicopter blades somewhere above. Bucky takes his chances that the streets will slow Steve and whoever the hell this other guy is down as he bolts for the underpass, cars honking and swerving as he runs through the highway, his heart pounding in his chest. He jumps down to the road beneath the overpass, scarcely avoiding one oncoming van when he turns and runs after, overtaking it, keeping his pace beside the vehicle he's running alongside to avoid someone hitting him by changing lanes. There's an uproar of honking and tires screeching behind him, and Bucky can only assume it's his pursuers, but he doesn't dare waste time by turning to look. He forces his legs to keep moving, needing to create as much distance between them as possible so he can slip away. The opportunity arises in the form of a black bike speeding toward him, the rider unsuspecting as Bucky skids the wall and grabs the handle as the bike speeds past, throwing the driver to the ground as he flips it in midair, landing on it and twisting the handles before the tires can even touch the ground. The bike jerks as it speeds the opposite way it came, Bucky expertly weaving it through traffic as he veers back to the right side of the highway, falling in line with the cars moving away from the overpass. He can still hear the sirens converging on him. Any moment, police cars will be overtaking him and the helicopter will be overhead. His only chance is to find cover and slip away, but he knows these streets, has spent the last 2 years wandering them, knowing this day would come. He makes a sharp right turn, the bike teetering dangerously as he whips around, but he keeps it upright and squeezes through a narrow alley not meant for traffic. It won't slow Steve or that other guy down, but Bucky's more concerned about escaping that helicopter at the moment. He cuts across the road the alley opens onto, and then dips down another, repeating the process until the sounds of police sirens and helicopter blades are faint in the distance. He's sure he's still being pursued on foot, but that will take a little more finagling to get rid of. As long as he's out of sight, he can slip inside or underground and disappear. He pulls the bike onto a residential street, careful not to draw attention to himself. If that helicopter catches sight of him, it's over. He'll never be able to outrun its line of sight. He turns onto a long, straight stretch of road beside the boardwalk and kicks the bike into gear, speeding up faster than even Steve could run. He hasn't turned around to check if he's out of sight yet, but when the chance comes to steer the bike onto a turn-off leading out of Queens North to Manhattan, Bucky takes it. If luck is on his side, they won't have shut down the highway yet. Turns out that for once Bucky is in luck, and the insurmountable midday Manhattan traffic isn't against him. He's able to weave the bike through backed-up vehicles until there's enough of a lull to turn around and confirm no one is directly behind him, and then he slips into the shadows, abandons the bike, and makes his way north to their rendezvous. The shipment yard is as sparsely populated as the last 3 times Bucky scoped it out. It's little more than a warehouse backed onto a small runway meant for 2-man cargo planes, conveniently placed just outside city limits. It's a small operation, complete with a whopping total of 2 planes and 1 large hangar that's at least a solid 10-minute walk from the main office. Bucky waits by the tree line until he's certain there's no one around the hangar, and then he makes his way toward the warehouse, keeping an eye out for any sign of his pursuers or, more importantly, for Peter. He makes it as far as the parking lot outside the hangar before he has to dive out of the way or be pinned down by the man in the black suit. Bucky's instantly back on his feet, blocking the blows and swipes as they come until a deep and urgent voice shouts, "Bucky! Duck!" And his body obeys before he's even thought the command through, watching in amazement as Steve's shield hits his attacker square in the chest and knocks him against the wall of the building. Bucky stands back up and turns to see Steve running up to him, accompanied by a somewhat familiar man in a winged red and gray flight suit. Steve positions himself between Bucky and the man in the black suit, arms out to break up the fight, while the man in the winged suit stands further back with his arms raised, holding a gun in each hand aimed at Bucky and the other guy respectively. "Get down on the ground!" the guy in the wingsuit demands, glaring at Bucky beneath a pair of red goggles. "I don't think you want to know just how happy I'd be to shoot you." Steve starts to send the man a reproachful look, but his gaze snaps back to the guy in the black suit as he stands up straight and takes a step toward them. "Move, Captain," he says lowly, his voice cold. Bucky places the accent immediately. Wakandan. "I won't ask a second time." It wasn't him, Your Highness, says Steve diplomatically, still standing between them. Bucky tries to stay focused on the threat of being shot by the guy behind him, clawed to death by the guy in front of him, or arrested by Steve next to him. But all he can focus on is glancing over his surroundings for any trace of his son. He should be here by now, but Bucky deeply prays that he isn't, knowing Peter would not hesitate to throw himself into this mess. I said down on the ground, Barnes. The other man shouts, his hands tightening on the gun's grip. His finger drags over the trigger, and Bucky's worst fear comes to life. Before the sound of the shot can even ring through the air, Peter lands on the ground between them, whipping the gun out of the guy's hands and flinging it across the runway toward the tree line. Bucky feels sick to his stomach, but Peter stands up straight, clad head to toe in his Spider-Man uniform. He hopes the boy changed into that when he got here and wasn't web-slinging across New York as Spider-Man, where Hydra could be looking for him, but now isn't the right time to ask. What the hell? The guy in the red goggles exclaims, looking at his empty hand and then back to Peter. Who the hell are you? Peter doesn't say anything, just lifts his hands and webs up the guy's other gun before he can even aim it at them. Bucky's attention is drawn away as the guy in the black suit lunges, intercepted by Steve countering with his shield. The two begin a brawl, and Bucky hastily turns and is relieved to see that Peter has webbed up the other man's feet, gluing him to the pavement. The guy has a knife pulled from his thigh holster and is frantically trying to cut through the webs with it, cursing colorfully the whole time. He doesn't waste a second of this opportunity. Bucky rushes forward and grabs Peter's shoulder, pulling him in the direction of the hangar. The kid takes the hint and starts running behind him, making a break for the building while their pursuers are distracted. Steve and the Wakandan man break apart when they start running, the Wakandan abandoning his fight with Steve to chase Bucky, Steve abandoning the fight to chase him. They're only a few feet from the bay doors when a loud noise fills the air like a rocket, only quieter. Peter comes to a stop beside him, and Bucky turns to question why, only to see his kid staring upward through his black goggles. Bucky follows Peter's line of sight, disbelief washing over him. God fucking damn it! Steve comes up behind them protectively as Iron Man lands on the roof of the hangar. He's joined by another man in a very similar suit. Bucky knows he's an Avenger from all of Peter's tales, but can't quite remember the name. Iron Warrior or something like that. Bucky can only imagine what Peter's face must look like right now, having come face to face with his childhood hero in the worst fucking possible circumstances. He's as rigid as stone beside him, looking as paralyzed as he did when he had a gun to his face the first night they met. And then Iron Man's helmet opens, his face revealed, and he glances at Bucky and Peter, his eyes lingering on Peter for a long moment, before he sneers at Steve. Adding kidnapping to the list of charges, Cap. It wasn't him, Tony! Steve implores, turning to face the man in the black suit behind them, still holding his arms out defensively. Just give me a chance to explain! Tony lowers himself off of the hangar, stomping on the ground ahead of them as the repulsors in his hands and boots power down. His friend joins him, effectively blocking their way, and Bucky resists the temptation to pull Peter closer to him, feeling the boy's fear in the air and instinctually needing to comfort him. Sounds like you have a lot of explaining to do, Tony says, and once again glances at Peter. The kid nervously shifts under his gaze, his tense muscles flinching slightly as he steps a little closer to Bucky. Bucky fixes Iron Man with a deep-heated glare, full of warning to stay the hell back! Barnes is not for you, the man from Wakanda says, but whether he's talking to Steve or Iron Man, Bucky isn't sure. I am the one who is bringing it to justice. Stand down, Cap, Tony says agreeably and lifts his hand, aiming his gauntlet at Steve's chest. You're outnumbered. Steve seems to think it over for a moment before he clearly makes his decision, his eyes not leaving the man in the black suit for a single second. I guess so, he says lightly before he's whipping his shield hard in Tony's direction while diving the other way to block the Wakandan's incoming attack. Stark is knocked back as the shield unexpectedly slams into his chest, and then his friend rushes forward. Bucky moves in front of Peter and goes to defend himself, but Steve shouts, Sam, a little help! And the man in the red goggles, Sam, apparently intercepts the Iron Man suit with a regretful sounding, Sorry about this, Colonel! Using the moment of chaos to their advantage, Bucky gestures for Peter to follow him and begins running from the hangar with Sun close behind him before Iron Man cuts them off, blocking their path again. His helmet is once again in place, and his voice is deep and robotic sounding as he says, Not so fast, aiming his palm at Bucky's head. They have no choice but to fight. Bucky half turns to Peter and says quiet and stern, I'll hold him off, you run for the hangar, wait for me there. No! Peter protests, just as quiet but much more desperate. I'm not leaving you out here alone! It's then that Iron Man's gauntlet lights up, glowing white and threatening as he holds his aim in Bucky's direction.
"Step away from the kid," he says, tone hard and angry. "Get on your knees, hands behind your head. Go, Peter," is all Bucky says before he's lunging forward, ducking below the blast that shoots out of Stark's glove before he's driving his metal fist into the suit's chest plate. Stark raises his arms to block, so Bucky plants a foot in the man's midsection and firmly kicks him back. Peter still hasn't moved, so Bucky turns back and quickly shouts, "Go!" That seems to snap Peter out of his daze, and he runs forward toward the hangar, Iron Man not stopping him, but taking advantage of Bucky's momentary distraction, delivering a heavy blow that sends him sprawling on his back. Bucky groans and tries to roll over to get back on his feet, but Stark aims another repulsor blast at him, threateningly, keeping him pinned down. For a moment, Bucky is terrified that Peter will come back and throw himself in front of the blast, but it's actually Steve who takes Iron Man down, ungracefully knocking into him just in time to stay the man's attack. The two exchange punches as they try to subdue the other, and Bucky jumps to his feet and sprints for the hangar, spotting Peter inside, desperately trying to open the door of a cargo plane. He almost makes it to him before he's tackled from behind. It's only instinct that has Bucky covering the back of his neck with his metal arm. The horrid sound of metal scraping metal filling the large open building as the claw-like nails of the Buchanan's suit scratches his arm. Bucky is able to roll over and block another attempt for his neck, desperately urging, "I wasn't in Vienna. I didn't kill your king." The man raises his hand, claws out, intending to swipe down and kill him. "Then why did you run?" Bucky barely manages to block the attack, countering with his own to try and get the man off of him. The man is frighteningly fast, and his attacks have more than enough deadly force behind them. Bucky doubts he would be able to beat this guy under the best of circumstances, and these are not the best of circumstances. A brutal punch to the ribs has Bucky's vision whiting out for a split second, and he groans from the pain, realizing a second too late that he's left his throat open and vulnerable to his attacker. He sees the light glinting off the man's metal claws as he raises them, and Bucky is sure that this is it, the end. The claws descend too fast to counter straight for his throat before his vision is obscured by red. "No!" The weight of the man lifts off of him, and Bucky forces himself to sit up despite the throbbing pain in his rib. The pain is washed away by the dread, the consuming, mind-numbing dread of realizing that Peter has knocked the man back, that he grabbed his hand just in time. Bucky stares ahead in shock, Peter kneeling in front of him, his mask gone, gripping the man's wrist to hold his hand still. Peter's back is to him, the man towering over him, so Bucky can't see his face, but he can picture the expression he must have based on the desperate, pleading sound of his voice. "Please!" Peter says, the man's claws still out and only inches from his face, his hand still gripping the man's wrist tightly. The man seems frozen, standing above them with his hand easily caught in Peter's much smaller one, obviously struck by the look on Peter's face. If the way he's staring down at him is anything to go by. "Please," Peter says again, begging, merely holding the man's wrist rather than restraining it. "Please don't hurt my dad." The wide eyes of the man's suit widen, and he drops his hand and takes a step back as though in shock. Bucky rushes to his feet and pulls Peter up at the same time, turning him around, checking him over, his hands cupping his cheeks when he finds no injuries. Peter, are you okay?" Peter nods, his own fear clear as day in his dark eyes, and he wraps his fingers around Bucky's metal wrist to hold on to before he turns back to the other man. We have alibis," Peter says, not letting Bucky herd him behind him when he tries. "We weren't at the UN, you can check, please. We were here. My dad was at work, you can ask his boss." The man looks at Bucky then. He has no idea what kind of expression he has on his face beneath his mask, but his wide eyes narrow as he seems to study him. Bucky figures it's their best shot and says, placing his hands on Peter's shoulders protectively, the boy's hands still tightly wrapped around his wrist. "It's true. It wasn't me." He looks at the man's eyes, keeps their gazes locked as he says, "I was running because I had to find my kid." If the man was about to say anything, it's interrupted by the sudden crash of a body being thrown through the metal sheets of the hangar's walls. The man in the winged suit, "Sam!" hits the pavement hard and rolls a few feet with a groan, coming to a stop and hardly moving as the non-Iron Man suit steps through the hole he made in the wall. The man raises his gauntlet at Bucky and Goldie says, "Considering it hasn't worked when everybody else said it, I'm not going to bother telling you to get down on your knees." He briefly glances at the man in the black suit and offers up a congenial, "You might want to get out of the way of this, Prince T'Challa," before his palms fill with light. Bucky grabs Peter's shoulder and tries to shove him out of the way, but Peter stiffens and stays glued in place, throwing his arms out to shield the Bucky from the blast the man has aimed at them. "Please, Mr. War Machine, please, just listen!" "Move, kid, or you're gonna get hurt!" War Machine says, not backing down. Step away from the Winter Soldier or I'll shoot! Bucky goes to lunge for the man, fear and rage driving him to embed his fist in the man's armor, but a frantic scream of, Rhodey, no! Gives Bucky pause and has the War Machine's hand lowering slightly. Iron Man flies through the bay doors, coming to a jerky stop next to his friend, and he grabs War Machine's weaponized gauntlet and aims it away, his helmet retreating. Rhodey, no, don't shoot, not the kid! Steve runs in just as a groan fills the hangar. Sam wobbles to his feet and Steve stops, bruised and bloodied, his gaze landing on Bucky and then spotting Sam leaning against the plane. Sam, are you alright? The man grunts and gives him a small wave, indicating that he'll live, and Steve rushes forward and inserts himself between Bucky and T'Challa, protectively. T'Challa still hasn't said a single word, gazing past Steve at Bucky and Peter, and soon all eyes are on them. Peter lowers his arms and steps a little closer to Bucky nervously, and Bucky takes him by the shoulder and pulls him against his side. War Machine's helmet retracts to show his confused face, and he stares at Stark before looking to Steve and then to Bucky and Peter. Okay, he says like he's trying to gather his thoughts. What the hell is going on here? I'd like to know that too, Tony says, satisfied once Rhodey's lowered his gauntlet. He turns a suspicious gaze on Steve and Bucky. Cap, you care to explain this? Steve glances at T'Challa, but when the man doesn't move or speak, he looks back to Tony and says, Buck says he was here, not in Vienna. I believe him. He deserves to have his alibis checked at least. He deserves a trial. He looks at T'Challa again as though expecting the man to object. I know you don't care, but I believe it wasn't him. Innocent until proven guilty. You're not exactly an unbiased party, Steve, Rhodey says. That wasn't even what I meant, Tony says, his eyes narrowed in anger. He looks down at Peter, and Bucky tenses when the kid's hands nervously fist into the fabric of his shirt. I meant, why the hell is the Winter Soldier here in New York with Spider-Man? Bucky flinches almost as hard as Peter does. He knows. Stark knows. He knows Peter's identity, knows about Spider-Man's existence, and a man like him with no shortage of money and resources at his fingertip, God only knows what else he knows. Everyone looks at Peter then, except Bucky and Tony, caught in a glaring match with each other. There's accusation and distrust painted plainly on Stark's face, and Bucky's sure he looks as threatened as he feels, his hackles raised, knowing they're trapped and surrounded and well and truly screwed. Then T'Challa straightens his back and says, I want to look into this man's alibis. All eyes in the room shift to him, and a look of surprised relief crosses Steve's face when he nods gratefully. Thank you, Your Highness. I have some conditions. T'Challa interrupts, his tone severe and leaving no room for argument. I want his location secured while we are investigating. Bucky pulls Peter a little closer to his side, looking at Steve when the man says, We can take him somewhere secure. If someone's framing him, chances are they're waiting for us to make a public spectacle of his arrest. We should go somewhere low-key. The kid can stay with me, Tony says, and Bucky's head snaps in his direction, his face twisting in anger. That's not happening, he says venomously, his glare heated and furious. My kid stays with me. This isn't up for debate, Rhodey says, lifting an eyebrow at him patronizingly. You do realize you're under arrest here, right? His reply dies in his throat when Stark sighs, pinching the bridge of his nose tiredly. Look, can we just calm down here for a second? Steve's shoulders seem to relax at his friend's bequest, and Bucky eyes him warily when he turns around and asks, Buck, if we'd agree to keep you two together, will you come with us? Peter leans more heavily against his side, so Bucky simply gazes back at Steve and replies, Apparently, I don't really have a choice. Your Highness, Tony addresses T'Challa, if we agree to work together to get to the bottom of what's really going on here, would you be willing to let us take Barnes into our custody while we figure it out? Bucky doesn't miss the way Stark's eyes briefly land on Peter before returning to the other men. I have a couple locations in mind that can be fully secured. You're more than welcome to check them out yourself first. A moment passes where T'Challa doesn't say anything, staring at Bucky through the unreadable white eyes of his mask. Then he nods, looking to Steve and then to Tony. I will allow him to stay with you while we investigate. But know this, Captain Rogers. If he is found guilty and if you allow him to escape justice, you will bear the wrath of Wakanda. Steve's voice is quiet but all too confident. You have my word, Your Highness. T'Challa nods. Stuck. he says, turning to Tony. You will inform me of where this man is being kept. Once I have discovered who is behind the bombing in Vienna, I will return to either collect him or free him. Peter wraps his arms around Bucky's middle like he's terrified the man is about to be snatched away from him. Realizing that he probably is, Bucky carved his metal fingers through the boy's hair, hoping to bring him comfort. T'Challa glances at them, then meets Bucky's eyes. I will uncover the truth, he says. It could be a threat, but Bucky swears he heard a hint of reassurance in the man's voice. I'll help you investigate. Stark offers, his helmet rebuilding itself over his face, turning his voice robotic again. 2 heads are better than 1 and all that. I will too, Steve says. Anything you need, just let me know. I do not believe that will be necessary, says T'Challa. He looks at Stark, his tone doubtful, but not unkind. But I will inform you if it is. Great, sounds like a plan, Tony says, his mask once more retreating. Plane's on its way as we speak. So, wait a minute, Rhodey interjects, incredulously staring at Tony. We're just going to say we lost him. You want us to lie about having custody of the Winter Soldier, hide a dangerous terrorist while we snoop around behind Ross's back in the middle of arguing about the Accords. Really, Tony? Stark pretends to think it over. His expressions are obviously fake that it's obnoxious. Yeah, I think that's exactly what we're going to do. Rhodey's disbelief doesn't lessen, so Stark genuinely looks at him and says, almost too quiet for Bucky to hear, Rhodey, this is Steve we're talking about here. Come on, now's the time to team up. Steve's face softens and he turns to Bucky, glancing down at the way Peter is still nervously clinging to him as he does. What do you say, Buck? He gives Peter a small smile, but the worry is practically etched into his face. Will you come with us until we've got all this figured out? Peter's arms tighten around his waist. Bucky knows there's no way they can outrun them now, so he nods, squeezing Peter's shoulder reassuringly as he does. My kid stays with me, he says again, making his only demand very clear. Steve nods to him, but then Bucky glances behind him at Stark, whose face does nothing to reassure him whatsoever. It's then that the roar of a plane overhead can be heard, and the group watches through the bay doors as the vehicle touches down on the runway, rolling to the other end opposite their hangar. Well, that'd be your ride, Tony says. Rhodey and I will fly ahead and get the place in lockdown mode. Sam should probably fly with you. He's not looking so hot. Bucky watches Steve turn and look at Sam, still resting against the cargo plane painfully. Stark turns to T'Challa. You need a lift too. You're more than welcome to hitch a ride with them. No need, T'Challa says and thumbs over the wristband of his suit. The rustling of trees is heard outside, and then a smaller, sleeker two-seater aircraft noiselessly touches down outside the hangar from the forest nearby. Stark stares at the thing with wide, impressed eyes. Huh. Okay, then. T'Challa turns to his plane, but then stops. He looks back at Tony, then at Steve, and at last to Bucky, his gaze drifting down to Peter and lingering there for a moment. I will be in touch, he promises before walking to his aircraft and boarding it. Tony turns back to Steve once he's gone. I'll leave transportation to you, he says, then nods his head to the plane at the end of the runway. It's a pilotless model, so you don't need to worry about a cover story or anything like that. I've already set the coordinates. It'll take off once you're on board. It will take us where, exactly? Bucky asks, the suspicion heavy in his voice. Stark glances at him, his own tone short and clipped. Montana. We have a lovely family cottage there for vacationing in the summer. Like I said, we'll fly ahead and secure it. But it's remote. Best place I can think of to lie low for now. Stark looks down at Peter again, his expression softening somewhat. You'll like it. It's quaint, but the property is nice. Bucky glances down at Peter, too, but the boy isn't looking at him or at Stark. His gaze is fixed on the bay doors and the runway beyond, his hands still tightly fisted in Bucky's shirt. Rhodey walks away from them to help Sam stand upright, offering him a muted apology as he half carries him toward the plane. Tony helps, taking Sam's other side and limping him down the runway, Steve and Bucky and Peter behind them. They could run now. This is most likely their last chance, Bucky realizes. They could subdue Steve and bolt back to the cargo plane, hijack it, and get as far away as they can. Or they can go with Steve, with the Avengers, and place their fates completely in someone else's hands. Bucky knows that running now would cement his guilt,
But he knows he isn't, so it's hard to weigh that against the fear and uncertainty of walking his own child into a potentially dangerous situation. Steve walks ahead of them to help load Sam into the plane, and Bucky's heart races with the anxious thought of, it's now or never. He's just about to stop walking toward the plane when Peter does, still clinging to his side and inadvertently tugging on Bucky's jacket as the man keeps moving. Bucky blinks and turns around, sees the pale, wide-eyed look on Peter's face.
Hey,
Bucky says, kneeling in front of him instantly, his tone gentle.
Hey, kiddo, what's wrong?
Peter's eyes stay fixed on the plane, round with fear, before he forces himself to look back at Bucky. I don't, he says quietly, his shoulders trembling. The realization crashes over him like a wave. Bucky takes Peter's face in his hands and says, as soothing as he can,
It's all right, Peter, it's okay. I know you're scared, but I'm going to be right there next to you the whole time.
Peter's gaze drifts back up to the plane, so Bucky gently makes the boy look at him again.
Hey, you know I'll never let anything happen to you, right?
Peter nods, giving him a small smile, but the anxiety doesn't leave his eyes. Bucky doesn't know what else to say, but then it hits him.
Hey.
He pets Peter's head comfortingly.
You can do this, kid. You're so damn brave. You already conquered one fear today, right? That Sam guy had a gun and you still took him down. You didn't even need to use the sewing needle. You didn't freeze.
He lets his hands fall back to Peter's shoulder, squeezing encouragingly.
What do you say? A little plane ride isn't as terrifying as that, is it?
But Peter shakes his head, disagreeing. No, Dad. Shame fills his voice for reasons totally unknown to Bucky. That's not why. It's not because I'm brave. I was terrified. He looks back up at him, his eyes wide, his voice trembling. I didn't freeze because he was shooting at you. Grief racks Bucky's whole body. Of all the things Peter said that had broken his heart, that one stings the worst.
Peter
glances at the plane again, his small body shaking as he forces himself to look back at Bucky. Dad, I'm scared. He's about to pull his son into his arms when someone steps up close behind him. Bucky swiftly stands and turns, shielding Peter with his body, but it's only Steve, who puts his hands up to show he means no harm, his face drawn in worry. Everything okay? Bucky opens his mouth to ask if they can have a minute alone so he can calm Peter down from the full-blown panic attack he's working himself into, but then his gaze flickers behind Steve at Stark standing on the stairs of the plane, watching them with a tight, tense expression. Stark eyes Peter with something akin to concern, but then pins Bucky with a heated, judgmental look, and Bucky feels a swell of irritation inside of him, knowing the man probably heard every word Peter said. Before he can lie and say that they're fine, Peter presses his forehead against Bucky's back, evidently missing out on that hug he knew was coming and now needing the comfort. Bucky drops his gaze from Stark's suspicious stare and Steve's worried expression and turns back to his son, taking Peter under his arm as he starts leading them toward the plane again.
Deep breaths, Pete,
he says quietly to him, his hand a comforting weight on Peter's shoulder.
Up right here.
Peter clings to his jacket as they climb the steps, both of their eyes widening at how spacious the inside is. Bucky's sure neither of them has ever seen a plane this extravagant before, but he can feel Peter's body pulled tight as a bowstring against his side, and he decides to skip any sort of tour in favor of leading Peter to a pair of seats.
Do you want the window seat?
He asks, pointing to the curtain above it.
If it's too much, we could always roll down the cover or switch.
Peter nods, so Bucky ushers him into the seat and takes the spot beside him. There's no sign of Sam anywhere, but this plane is so unnecessarily large that it wouldn't surprise Bucky if it had a separate chamber with a bed that Steve and Stark deposited him in. Bucky and Peter both glance out the window as the sound of repulsors flare up outside. Steve is there saying his goodbyes to Tony and Rhodey before the two men blast upward and out of sight. Steve watches for a moment, then climbs the steps and enters the plane. As the doors shut, the stairs fold up into the belly of the plane like an accordion, and Peter tenses beside him and leans against Bucky harder as the engine roaring to life can be heard and felt throughout the vehicle. Steve spots them from the door and makes his way over, observing them, and Bucky can practically feel the doubt radiating off the man. He isn't acting cold exactly, but the long disbelieving look he gives Peter has Bucky's hackles raised. Mind if I sit? Steve asks, gesturing to the seats in front of them, facing them. Bucky gives a small nod and Steve sits, the seats far enough apart that there's a solid foot of space keeping their knees from touching. As the plane begins to move, Peter nestles deeper into his side, so Bucky lifts his metal arm and allows the boy to practically glue himself to him. When the plane's speed picks up and the liftoff begins, Bucky wraps his arm across Peter's chest, feeling the boy shaking against his metal palm. His sleeve rides up, and the light pouring in from the window catches on his wrist, drawing Steve's gaze to it. Bucky observes intensely, the hardened expression on the man's face deepening. Then Peter clings to his metal arm, hugging it, and Steve blinks and looks back up at Bucky, meeting his eyes. They study each other for a moment, neither one of them saying a thing, until Bucky pulls Peter tighter against his chest and looks away as the plane leaves the ground.